Welcome to Off the Wall. My name is Trey. Thank you so much for joining me today. Typically during the season, each week I want to spend some time talking through the past weekend's games, talking about some of the highlights, talk about some of the lowlights and everything in between. Then we'll preview some of the games on the schedule for the next weekend ahead. Pretty straightforward sports podcast stuff. We are in the midst of the Indoor Football League season now, and the Arena Football League season is right around the corner. And I'm working on getting some interviews set up as well as to include in future episodes. So we should have a good mix of different types of content come down the pipeline soon. But as the title says, this is episode 1. And I wanted to set the table for the rest of this podcast. And what I mean by that is some folks listening may be new to indoor and arena football entirely. And maybe some are more recent fans who are getting into the groove of things this season or kind of haven't watched in a little while, but some of the news of some of the leagues coming back is what got them back into it. I know a friend of mine found out about what I'm doing here at Off the Wall, and she said, arena football, isn't that just football played inside? Which is a fair question. On the surface, it is football, correct. But there are nuances to the game that make indoor and arena football stand out from the traditional game. But what are those differences and where did this all start? So we're going to dive into the history of arena and indoor football from the original concept to the rises and falls that the sport has experienced along the way. Even if you are familiar with indoor and arena football, there are some things that we'll go through today that you may not know. While doing some research for this episode, there were a lot of things that I learned about regarding the origins of the sport and helped me understand certain things a little bit better. So this week, we're not going to dive into any games. We'll get into the groove of that next week. But this week, I really wanted to dive into the history of the sport and how we got to where we are today. So let's dive in. The concept of arena football was created by a man named Jim Foster while watching an indoor soccer match at Madison Square Garden in New York City in 1981. Jim worked for the NFL at the time, and he pitched an idea for this alternative indoor football sport to a few colleagues, and they absolutely loved it. Even some getting on board, and they reached a deal with NBC for a test game that they called it, kind of like a pilot for a TV show. So things were ready to go way back in 81, but then everything with this was put on hold when the USFL was launched, which was a spring football league that was launched as a competitor to the NFL, but truthfully never really was. The USFL was launched in 1982, which Jim Foster had gotten a job with after jumping ship from the NFL. It wasn't until the USFL ceased operations in 1985 did the momentum start to pick back up with arena football. Jim Foster, with some newfound free time on his hands after, the whole USFL thing didn't work out, was able to execute that test game that was originally agreed upon on April 27th, 1986 in Rockford, Illinois, about 90 miles outside of Chicago. They recruited volunteer players from local colleges to the teams, which were named the Chicago Politicians and the Rockford Metros. The branding could have used a little bit of work, but hey, we all got to start somewhere. The initial test game went well, so they planned for another game the next year, February 27th of 1987, where they were actually able to iron some things out and even got some of the highlights on ESPN SportsCenter, which was huge. They basically created the sport, played 2 games, and they were featured on SportsCenter. With that momentum, the Arena Football League was born. The initial inception of that league had 4 teams. It was the Pittsburgh Gladiators, the Denver Dynamite, the Washington Commandos, and the Chicago Bruisers. So just 4 teams in this initial league. In hindsight, it's a little curious why they chose such spread out cities like that, but nonetheless, the first draft of the AFL was created. The first game in AFL history wasn't actually aired on TV. They wanted to work out any kinks before going on national television and facing potential scrutiny. So they played a game. So there might not be any footage. I haven't looked this up. I probably should have, but there might not be any footage of the first actual game of arena football. They made their television debut the next day on June 20th, 1987. So they got some momentum going with their first season in 1987. Eventually, at the end of the season, they played what's called the Arena Bowl, which is the Super Bowl for arena football. Arena Bowl 1 was played at the conclusion of the season, as you could probably put together. with the Denver Dynamite defeating the Pittsburgh Gladiators 45-16. So after the full season was completed, after they worked through most of the kinks that they could think of at the time, our boy Jim Foster filed an application with the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office to patent his invented sport, which is crazy. He invented a sport. But they looked to build some momentum and slowly started to gain some popularity across the nation. But much of America learned about the AFL in July of 1989 for an unintended reason, when the Pittsburgh Gladiators head coach, Joe Herring, punched the commissioner, our boy Jim Foster, during a game with the Chicago Bruisers. So a lot of people's first exposure to the AFL, if they didn't see it on TV, was reading a national media headline about a coach punching a commissioner in the face. So it was like there was a photo in the USA Today, typical national media, right? But apparently Foster had walked onto the field of play to mediate an altercation between the two teams with Herring, a former NFL assistant. He just punched him in the jaw, and Herring was eventually suspended. Needless to say, the early days of the AFL were a little chaotic, both on and off the field. So we have an idea of the conception of the league and how it was created and how they kind of got some momentum going. But what specifically makes it different? Let's dive into some of the rules of arena football. So we're not going to hit all the rules, but these are the ones that are the most noticeable, that if you're watching the game for the first or second time, you'll for sure notice. But what made the AFL and arena football so unique is how the game differed from the outdoor game. It was a true alternative. I think where some of the spring football leagues that haven't worked in the past failed was that it was too similar to what was already taking place in the fall with college football and the NFL. Arena football was a true alternative where it was still technically football, but the way the game was played was drastically different, and it was like a new flavor of football. First off, the field is half the size, half the length of an NFL field, I should say, and half the width of an NFL field. So an arena football field is 50 yards long versus an NFL field being 100 yards long. And then it's also about 22 to 23 yards wide, while an NFL field is about, I think, 52 yards wide. So it's a little less than half the width, half the length. It's about the quarter of the size of a standard traditional outdoor football field. Now surround that 50-yard field with padded walls, and you have arena football. Just imagine football being played on a thawed-out hockey rink with turf all throughout. It's not uncommon to see players get tackled into the walls and sometimes over them into the crowd. It's quite the in-person experience at these games, and those walls are where the name of this comes from, off the wall. So let's talk about offense in arena football. In arena football, one player can be in motion towards the line of scrimmage when the ball is snapped. Aside from the smaller field, this traditionally is one of the more recognized trademarks of the arena game since its creation. The usage of the player in motion has evolved over the years, and offensive coaches can get pretty creative, and it creates some very interesting wrinkles to the game if the coaching staff is creative enough and willing to try some things. This rule literally gives the offense a running head start on a play, which creates some massive scoring opportunities, and that's by design. The people who created this league and the people who have run the arena football and indoor leagues, they want high scoring games because they want an entertaining product for the fans, because ultimately the fans are going to be what keeps the lights on. Another interesting aspect of arena football is something called the Iron Man rule. So the Iron Man rule means that 6 of the 8 players on the field play both offense and defense, which is pretty crazy to think about. You think of the college football and professional NFL football. Usually you see not usually, almost all the time you see a player play one position and that's what they play. That's not the case in arena football. Most commonly, you'll see the following players playing both sides of the ball. You'll see an offensive lineman / defensive lineman. You'll see a running back / linebacker. You'll see a wide receiver / linebacker. Then you'll see a wide receiver / defensive back. So these players have to be extremely well-rounded, not to mention well-conditioned as well, to play basically an entire game on both offense and defense. Another thing about arena football you may notice when you first watch is that there's giant nets on the side of the field goal post. So the field goal post is only about 9 to 10 feet. I think it's 9 feet, but there's these giant nets off the sides that the ball can come in contact, and it's a live ball. So on kickoffs and missed field goal attempts, teams can kick it into one of the large rebounding nets, they call them. And that's a live ball that can be scooped up by either team. And every now and then you'll get the occasional Hail Mary throw off the net too, which is thrilling when it happens. So you more likely you're going to see it on kickoffs and field goal attempts, but every now and then you'll get a quarterback get a little ambitious and throw one off the net and see what happens. One of my favorite rules that I hope they bring back in 2024. I haven't seen it confirmed if they will or not, but it's one of my favorite rules in any sport all time. It's the ability for one of the outer offensive linemen to declare themselves eligible as a receiver. So that means on any given play, if they declare themselves eligible, basically put their hand up and look at the ref and say, hey, I'm an eligible receiver, they can go out for a pass and the quarterback can throw them the ball legally. Now, everyone listening to this, I want you to close your eyes. Close your eyes. Now, I want you to imagine a 6'6", 335-pound offensive lineman catching a ball gracefully and galloping down the field like the gazelle that he is. It's a thing of beauty, and it's just one of the many things that makes arena football so enjoyable to watch. So I really hope they bring that back for 2024, but we'll see. So those are just a couple of the rules that kind of distinguish arena football from the outdoor game. That's in no means all encompassing. There are lots of little intricacies and nuances that we could get into maybe a little bit later. But we just want to go over like the basics to get you started. So you have a basic gist of the rules on a surface level. But one of the things that's plagued arena football for ages was its inconsistency with having teams in existence for long periods of time. Most teams flamed out for various reasons, but there were some successful ones that had staying power for 10, 20, sometimes even 30 years. One of the earliest success stories in the AFL was the Detroit Drive, who went to the Arena Bowl each of their 5 years of existence. They played regularly sold-out games at Joe Louis Arena in Detroit and was considered the first dynasty of the league. And this was in the early 90s when the league was very, very new. Many teams came and went over the years, especially in the 90s. We don't have nearly enough time today to deep dive all of them. I'm sure we will eventually at some point. But here are some of the highlights of some of the short-lived teams when you go through the list, and some of the names are just A1, so good. We got the Buffalo Destroyers, the Cincinnati Rockers, the Connecticut Coyotes, the Houston Thunder Bears, the Las Vegas Sting, the Memphis Pharaohs, the Miami Hooters, the Minnesota Fighting Pike, the Portland Forest Dragons, the Texas Terror, and so many more. The names were always great. The branding was always great. The uniforms were almost always great. It was just a very aesthetically pleasing in the 90s and 2000s. Oftentimes there was instability in the leadership and ownership groups of these teams and suffered from lack of continuity that some of the other successful franchises had. Weak ownership groups, lack of financial support, lack of proper media exposure, and some cities honestly just not caring about their team were points of impending doom for a lot of teams in the 90s and 2000s. While there were teams that flopped, there were also quite a few teams that set up really strong roots in their communities and were around for a long time, and some of them are still around today. The Arizona Rattlers, they were formed in 1992. They're still around today. The Iowa Barnstormers, they were formed in 1995. They're still around today. San Jose Sabercats, they were developed in 1995. They were around for nearly 20 years. Orlando Predators and Tampa Bay Storm, they were both created in 1991. Predators are still around today. Storm were around for 20 plus years. So it wasn't all bad, but a lot of trial and error to say the least when it came to finding good ownership groups in the right situations in the right cities that would support it. The league had games airing throughout these early seasons on ESPN, and they were chugging along, surviving year to year, making it work with a different collection of teams on an annual basis. Um, every single year, it seemed like 3, 4 teams were dropping out, 2, 3, 4 teams were being created for the entire stretch of the 90s. But what the AFL was missing was a success story. It was missing a superstar that would emerge from the league and make a big splash in the NFL. And in 1999 to 2000, they got that. In 1999, an NFL quarterback by the name of Kurt Warner took the NFL by storm, eventually winning Super Bowl 34, became Super Bowl MVP. He was that success story that the AFL needed to gain positive national attention. They didn't want the coaches punching the commissioner national attention that they got early on. They wanted some positive attention that could give some credibility to the league when it needed it the most. And as a league, they wanted to show that this is where players can go to compete and develop and potentially find a path to the next level, whether that be in the NFL, the CFL, wherever that is. So part of this positive attention that they got resulted in a new TV deal, which was great for the league. This time with TNN, which would air their regular season games live, which was huge for the sport. In the 2000s, the AFL had grown and expanded so much that they created their own development league called the AF2. This was like a minor league system similar to what NFL Europe used to be, similar to like the minor league baseball farm systems that they have, where raw players who may be new to the arena game but are physically talented enough to play could go and hone their craft with the new rules and kind of learn the way the game flows and then work their way up to the AFL. So the league continued this upward trajectory with some minor setbacks along the way through the 2000s. Like just because they left the 90s doesn't mean the 90s problems left. Like they were still there. They eventually landed a TV deal with NBC for weekly games and coverage. And this was massive for the league because it was, again, continuing to build on positive national television exposure. And that's what they needed. They needed attention. They needed exposure. So at this point, the league is growing year by year, has its own development league, a sweet TV deal. Surely nothing can go wrong, right? As you can imagine, this is where things started to get a little shaky for the AFL because in 2008, the league commissioner, David Baker, retired from his role with the league. Baker had been commissioner for 12 years and was one of the primary reasons for how well the league had scaled, and him retiring was huge. Speaking of huge, David Baker is a mountain of a man. If you like pull up a picture of David Baker right now on your phone, if you're listening to this, if you're watching this, go ahead, pause it. Pull up a picture. This man is quite literally 6'9", 400 pounds, like one of the biggest humans I've ever seen in person. And you'll quite frankly ever see in your life. It's no wonder he was able to negotiate so many great deals for the league and set them up for success. It's like negotiating with the mountain from Game of Thrones. But anyway, in 2008/2009, something else happened in the world. The Great Recession struck the globe, and its impacts were felt everywhere, but especially the AFL. The AFL ran into some cash flow issues in 2008 and sought out an investment from a group called Platinum Equity. The investment would boost $100 million into the league, and in turn, the group would have a centralized single entity business model that the league would operate under and kind of make things a little bit more efficient. But what that was doing was taking away some of the power from the individual owners. And the owners of the league were not very happy with that. So the investment ultimately never materialized, but by that point, the damage had been done. There were rumors that the league was in trouble, but naturally the owners denied it. They were like, no, everything's fine. Everything's great. If you have to come out and say everything's fine, everything's probably not fine. The players union ultimately had to agree to a lower salary cap in order for the league to even have a chance to survive. So the players were taking a pay cut just to play so that the league could potentially survive that year. But the league ultimately decided to suspend the 2009 season in order to restructure into a more feasible model. But that never happened, and the league ultimately folded after collecting nearly an 8-figure debt, and they filed for bankruptcy. So that was the end of arena football and the AFL as we knew it. The AF2, that minor league, stuck around for the 2010 season, but was eventually dissolved as part of that bankruptcy. The AF2 teams eventually decided to form its own legal entity and eventually purchased the rights of the original AFL assets. So in a weird way, the AF2 was the creation of the AF2 was like the saving grace for arena football, because the AF2 survived for just long enough for those owners to buy the assets and branding of AFL, and they just relabeled the AF2 as the new Arena Football League. So the AFL name would be slapped on this new legal entity, and arena football was back. It was just like a like a new coat of paint, and the Arena Football League was born again. With the AFL assets being purchased by this new league, the AFL, air quote AFL, had new life and a fresh start. And part of that fresh start were games on the NFL Network. The AFL was able to add some of the legacy team names of the past as part of the reboot. And then they added some additional franchises as well, like the Jacksonville Sharks as an expansion franchise in 2010. In 2012, the AFL became the first non-motorsports league to have a title sponsor. So they weren't called the Arena Football League. They were called the Net 10 Wireless Arena Football League up until 2014. They were just looking for every single way that they could make money and keep this thing afloat and keep this thing going. But in 2013, the league expanded and introduced a little team called the LA Kiss. So this team was owned by the members of the band Kiss, Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley. And in 2014, the league granted team rights to Motley Crue frontman Vince Neil. Eventually, he founded the Las Vegas Outlaws. So we were entering this new rock and roll era of arena football, so to say. But around this time, some teams started to fold and others began to jump ship to other leagues, which we'll touch on in a bit. Kind of similar to what was happening in the 90s. Teams started dropping like flies for various reasons, some poor attendance, some mediocre ownership investment, both financially and mentally. Like some people were interested in being called an owner of a team more so than actually owning a team and doing the day-to-day stuff that was required there. So the league was left with about 8 teams in 2016, and it got a little more turbulent from there. And in 2016, 2 of the more successful franchises that were still around, the Orlando Predators and the Jacksonville Sharks, they left. And that was a crippling blow to the league. The Predators had been in the AFL since 1991. They had been in the league since 1991, and they jumped ship 25 years later. So that's how bad things were. And then fast forward to 2019, the league ceased operations for a second time, citing a, quote, lack of capital and unresolved liabilities. So the AFL rose, fell, rose again, and fell, ultimately for some of the same reasons as before: cash flow problems and instability amongst the leadership groups of the teams. But remember about 2.5, 3 minutes ago, I said something about teams were jumping ship from the AFL to another league. What was that other league? The answer is the Indoor Football League, which is the IFL. The Indoor Football League was born out of a merger in 2008 between 2 smaller leagues, the Intense Football League and United Indoor Football. The brand of football that the IFL plays is similar to that of arena football, but slightly different in more nuanced ways. They sound like they should be synonymous, but ultimately they're not. Anyway, 14 combined teams from the previous 2 leagues made up the IFL initially, with 19 teams competing in the inaugural season. That's a lot of teams. Starting off, many of these teams were based in the Midwest, based out of simple necessity with some outliers. The biggest headache for teams in smaller leagues like this is logistics and travel. So being able to drive, being in driving distance to many of these places was a necessity and just made things so much easier starting off. You had teams like the Billings Outlaws, the Sioux Falls Storm, which are still in the IFL today, the Omaha Beef, legendary name, the River City Rage, amongst others. They quickly expanded to 25 teams in 2010. And with teams stretching from Richmond, Virginia to Arkansas to Green Bay, Wisconsin to Corpus Christi, Texas, all the way up to Alaska and everywhere in between. But they suffered from trying to grow too quickly. And a few years into the IFL, the Texas teams, they all withdrew and they formed their own league, partially due to travel logistics. They thought, hey, if we have a league of 8 Texas teams, we could just stay in the state. We don't have to fly our boys from Corpus Christi to Alaska for a game. Like that was just logistics wise, it was a nightmare. So things ebbed and flowed for the IFL, going down to 10 teams in 2014. So they went from 19 to 25 to 10 in the span of about 4 to 5 years. But that was right about the time that some teams from the AFL, remember they were having some issues of their own around this time, they came knocking. So the Iowa Barnstormers, famous for being the team that Kurt Warner played for before becoming an NFL Hall of Famer, joined the league in 2015 and gave the league a nice little boost in the arm almost immediately. There is something unique about the IFL that is worth noting when it comes to the rules. There was a rule implemented in 2016 that restricted rosters and called for all teams to carry no more than 7 players with 3 or more years of experience in indoor arena football. Now, you may be thinking, that's odd. Why would they do that? Go ahead, ask. That's odd. Why would they do that? Well, the reason is because one of these teams, the Sioux Falls Storm, was an absolute wagon of a dynasty in the IFL since its inception. They won the league championship every single year from 2011 to 2016 with a lot of the same players year in and year out. They've won 11 league championships over the past, I think, 19 years. They quite frankly, they were running a monopoly on the league for a very long time, and the league had to do something to save itself from itself. So the roster rule is super interesting because it positions the IFL as a development league, and they embrace that. That's something that the current commissioner, Todd Tryon, emphasizes all the time. They want players to develop and take the next step in their career, whether that be to the UFL, to the CFL, or even the NFL. They want these players to develop and grow beyond the IFL. But in 2016, yet another legacy team from the AFL jumped ship to the IFL. It's the Arizona Rattlers. We mentioned them before. They were founded in 1992. This was a huge pickup for the IFL as it was a team and brand that had been around for such a long time, longer than nearly any other current franchise in the entire indoor and arena landscape. Some of the other teams came and went during this time, but 2018 and 2019 is when the league really started to grow and began to hit its stride. The expansion of the league went from having a Midwest focus to being featured in the Southwest region of the United States as well. The Tucson Sugar Skulls, the San Diego Strike Force, the Frisco Fighters were all established as expansion teams. The Quad City Steamwheelers and the Duke City Gladiators joined the IFL from another league. And going into the 2020 season, however, things came to a halt, which I'm sure you could figure out why. The whole season had to be postponed and eventually fully canceled due to the global pandemic. This was a tough blow to the league that was starting to get a full head of steam, but they were able to continue building with additional teams getting added to the league in 2021, 22, and 23, reaching a total of 16 teams heading into the 2024 season. Today, the IFL has a geographic reach from San Diego to Jacksonville to Lowell, Massachusetts, and many places in between. And 2024 was the first year in league history that every single team from the year before returned for the following season. So the IFL is really starting to hit its stride now, and they're putting out a very entertaining product. And it's just great to see an indoor league start to develop some continuity year over year, and they're continuing to build on that. So you got to give props to the leadership of the league and some of the owners in the IFL for keeping the band together, and it's ultimately good for each other if they can have some longevity and continuity together. So we've gone over the rise, fall, rebirth, and then fall again of the AFL. We've touched on what the IFL is and where that currently stands, but one of the reasons I created Off the Wall was because the AFL is coming back in 2024. So AFL 3.0, as it's being called, is not officially, but by people, I'm people. AFL 3.0 is set to kick off on April 27th, which, if you remember, was the original date of the very first test game back in 1986. And if we're being honest, the rollout wasn't great, but the league and teams have been making progress and building up to its re-debut. There will be 16 teams in the new AFL, some of which are legacy teams that were in the AFL in years past. So some team names like the Albany Firebirds, the Nashville Cats, the Philadelphia Soul, the Orlando Predators, and the Georgia Force are a handful of teams that will be reintroduced to the AFL. There are also a handful of teams that were absorbed from another league and a couple of expansion teams that will be playing their first down of football ever in the AFL this season. It's a very exciting time in the world of indoor and arena football, and I'm excited to get things started with the podcast. Again, this was intended as a somewhat abbreviated oral history of arena football and indoor football, and this is by no means all-encompassing of everything that has happened. We'll dive into further specifics of things in future episodes, but I really wanted to set the table for indoor and arena football and what it is on episode 1 before diving into talking about the games themselves. If you don't already, please give us a follow on Twitter /X, whatever you want to call it, Instagram and TikTok. I've been getting active on those as the 2024 IFL season kicked off and as we get close to the AFL season kicking off. And I've had a really great time so far connecting with people over the love of the game. So if you do give me a follow, I will be indebted to you in the form of a virtual high five, solely redeemable via DM. So follow me at Off the Wall FB, F as in foot, B as in ball, Off the Wall FB on each of those platforms. Hope to see you on there. Say hi, troll me, ratio me, do all that fun stuff. And lastly, there's only 24 hours in a day, and I'm grateful that you spent some of that time with me today. We'll get into games starting on next week's episode, so we'll see you then. Thank you.